Hey, party people. Welcome to the second installment of my much requested fashion history series. This series is a little different than other costume history video series. Costume history is absolutely fascinating, and we could deep dive literally for years. But this video series is really about hitting the main points that a modern fashion designer needs to know. This video will cover the 1920s, and I'll link the fashion history playlist in the description box below. Let's start with the timeline of major events to give a framework for the fashion. Welcome to the Roaring Twenties. Orientalism impacted fashion from 1909 until about 1926. And I went over Orientalism's roots and aesthetic in the previous video in this series. The Jazz Age started in 1918, right after World War I, and continued through to the 30s. And historians disagree about when exactly the Jazz Age ended, and that's why I have that little question mark there. The Prohibition era started in 1920 in the United States. And Prohibition was a ban on the production and distribution and sale of alcohol, but not technically the drinking of alcohol. So people were stockpiling years and years worth of alcohol before the ban went into effect. And, in general, when things become forbidden, they become more exciting. And so this era birthed a ton of wild clubs, speakeasies, the birth of jazz, youth migrating away from farms and into cities for a more exciting life. These things were a result of, post war life and prohibition. This era birthed the new woman, those scandalous women who smoked and drank and partied. They had jobs, they drove, they bared their calves in short skirts and danced to jazz and illegal speakeasies. And by short, in the 20s, we're talking just below the knee, hovering around the knee. We don't get super short like mid thigh until the 60s. Do not trust Halloween costumes to give you historical accuracy. World War I officially ended in 1918, and many women kept jobs they started during the war, and their clothes started accommodating their new lifestyle and attitudes. The 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution gave white women the right to vote in 1920. Many believe that women's rights movement furthered androgynous fashion and the continued decline in the use of corsets. In 1922, French novelist Victor Marguerite published his famous novel La Garçon, which describes the transformation of a young woman into what we now know as a tomboy. Also in 1922, Pharaoh's tomb was discovered in Egypt, and Egyptian motifs started embellishing Western clothes. In 1923, the Charleston became a popular dance craze, which required low waisted dresses with fullness at the hems to accommodate all the kicking. The dresses kind of followed the dance movements. In 1924, Edward, Prince of Wales, visited the US and started a big trend in these short pants called plus fours. Named so because the short pants were 4 inches longer than knickerbockers, which were the short pants popular in the previous decades. The International Exhibition of Modern Decorative and Industrial Arts in Paris took place in 1925 from April through to October. And about 20 countries participated. They came to Paris and they built these pavilions to basically show off what amazing works in the decorative arts that these countries had and created. And fashion designers made up a large number of the exhibitors. It was kind of like a art and design Olympics where the best from each country come to show off in one central location. It's a very interesting event. I encourage you to research more on it. Josephine Baker, African American expat entertainer extraordinaire, agent of the French Resistance, and civil rights activist, popularized the Eton crop hairstyle in 1926, a short style worn very close to the head, perfect to fit under the cloche hats that were so popular in the 20s. Elsa Schiaparelli made her first mark in fashion in 1928 with a black and white wool knit trompe-l'oeil sweater, and trompe-l'oeil looks continued to be a signature of hers. And her career highlights occur mainly in the 30s, so we'll discuss her more in depth in the next video. Paul Poiret went out of business in 1929, and the Great Depression hit in 1929. And yeah, sure, Poiret was great, but those two events are not related. Now that we've got the general mood of the era, let's talk about silhouettes and major trends. Body types, what is, widely considered as the ideal body type, they go in and out of fashion as well as the clothes. And during this period, the ideal was flat chested and narrow hipped. Corsets were becoming less and less popular, but if they were worn, they were used to create this straighter, narrower look. There were two main silhouettes in style during the 20s. And this is the first time in a long time that more than one main silhouette is in style at the same time within the same group of people. And by that I mean popular style in the Western world. The Belle Epoque hourglass is no longer in style. The new woman look featured dresses cut straight through the waist, and necklines were also higher to further de emphasize the bust. Evening dresses of this shape were loose, often slipped over the head with no closures. Pointed hems, handkerchief hems, shawls, often with fringe, were very popular. The second silhouette is called the robe de style look. This look, whose origins were credited to Jean Lanvin, combined the relaxed long waists that have been evolving from the previous decade with full, wide to the side skirts of 18th century gowns. These skirts were shorter and lighter, and the 18th century skirts were very, very wide, not round like hoop skirts. And then the robe de style skirts were smaller and softer, supported by underskirts that were like small baskets set on the hips. And there were a lot of dresses that were kind of in between the new woman, kind of straight, narrow look, and the robe de style silhouette. Metallics like lame or tulle threaded with metallics were very popular throughout the 20s, which makes sense to me. I don't know if you can have jazz without some gorgeous gold dresses. Feathers were also wildly popular in 20s evening wear, and shoes were often closed sandals, strap pumps in all manner of materials and decorations. And the roaring 20s were all about sparkle and shine, and that included the shoes. The heels were short in modern comparison, thick and slightly curved. Switching gears a little, the 20s were also the suntan era, showing more skin, and tanning or faking tans became popular. Yes, fake tans were a thing in the 20s through powders and stockings. I always want to talk about the innovations and materials usage in each time period. And the biggie from the 20s is the evolution of the usage of knitwear. Let's talk about knitwear, especially jerseys made out of cotton and wool. In the late 1910s, women started wearing cardigans and long sweaters, mostly for sports activity or to like lounge around in resorts. And Jean Patou is often credited with the invention of the knit sweater, swimsuit, and sportswear in general. And not sportswear as we know it now and called separates, but actual clothes made for sport. Patou dressed sports stars, actresses, and dancers like Josephine Baker. Chanel also designed jersey coats and suits. These knitwear ensembles kept their sporty air with stripes and zigzag patterns and details. Before Patou and Chanel, jersey was typically used as underwear. Knitwear ensembles were so comfortable and they traveled well, so their popularity grew and cheaper versions entered the mass market. Let's talk about some of the big designers of the day and their contributions. Jean Patou, Coco Chanel, and Jean Lanvin were all mentioned in the previous video, and they continued to be influential during the 20s. Patou was first to create buzz around a fashion show as a social event, inviting friends and press, serving a champagne supper, passing out perfume samples, and he was also among the first to put his monogram on his designs, predicting the cachet of a designer logo. Patou also stood out for other reasons. He insisted on fabrics dyed at the yarn stage, not after yarns had been woven or knit like other designers. And he insisted on creating Patou's signature colors, including a dark blue with violet undertones called Patou Blue. Madeleine Vionnet had been working in fashion since childhood, and she set up her own house in 1912, closed up during the war, and reopened in 1919. She designed on the round. She didn't sketch, she draped on a half form, a dress form exactly half the size of a regular dress form, so a pattern maker or modeliste could take the drape and simply double all the measurements to create the pattern. Designing on the round allowed her to discover the bias cut. She also believed in creating backs of dresses to look very different from the front, which was new at the time. She was very knowledgeable about fabrics, and her materials were specially made 2 meters wide to accommodate her bias cuts. Couture, which was run by the four Callot sisters, opened in 1895. Madame Gerber, the sister that was recognized as the head designer, innovated the use of kimono sleeves in Western dress, according to Vionnet, who worked at Couture before opening her own house. Couture was very influential throughout the first quarter of the century, but like Poiret, as Orientalism faded out, so did their influence, and they were eventually absorbed into another business in the 30s. Edward Molyneux won a fashion contest sponsored by Lucille and was promptly hired. During World War I, he served as a captain. He was wounded 3 times, lost sight in one eye before coming home from the war and setting up his Maison de Couture. This is not relevant to this time period, but Molyneux is also known for spearheading efforts to employ and help garment workers and war victims during World War II. Molyneux is known for classy, tasteful, simple, sleek designs that weren't matronly. Jacques Heim isn't a well known name these days, but was a major player in fashion for decades. Jacques Heim joined his family's fur business in 1923. The family business had opened in 1898, but it was Jacques who opened a couture department for coat suits and evening dresses, and he was known for his truly clever works in fur, working with fur as if it were a fabric. The couture business proved so successful, they moved the business into increasingly larger and more fashionable addresses in the 30s. And he continued to innovate into the 30s and 40s, so we'll visit his works again. Norman Hartnell also championed the robe de style look and first came into prominence by dressing aristocratic brides in the late 20s. He set up his business in 1923. He clothed 4 generations of the British royal family, and most of his works were more famous in later decades, so we will visit his works later as well. Next, some notes on menswear. The men's evening attire standard was tailcoat, white vest, stiff bosom shirt with wing collar, white bow tie, and a black top hat or opera hat, black patent leather shoes, and of course, an overcoat. Even in the summer, you had to have an overcoat. A tailcoat is different from a cutaway coat. Tailcoats are like mullets, short in the front, long in the back, and they're about knee length in the back. Cutaway coats come together in the front and angle away more gradually and tend to be a little bit shorter than tailcoats. Cutaway coats and morning coats are the same thing. If you want to know more about modern coat vocabulary, you can watch my fashion vocab video on coats, which I'll link below. I go over what a Chesterfield is, what a frock coat is, all that good stuff, and I go over both menswear and women's wear. The acceptable ties were bow ties, ascot cravats, or a four in hand. For day wear, there's not a lot of major distinctions between the suits of the 20s and your suits of today. Single or double breasted, mostly neutral colors, shirt, vest, tie, trousers. The biggest difference in the shirts were how sharp and short and high the collars were. Back then, when you said flannel, they were not plaid pajamas. Flannel, the actual definition, is a wool, and in modern times, sometimes cotton. It's a wool with a soft brushed surface. Flannels in the 20s were popular summer trousers. If you want to know more about wool, you can watch my fabric video where I go over a lot of different wool swatches, and I'll link that video below as well. Jackets were trimmed to the body in the beginning of the 20s and started loosening up and getting a bit boxier. And trousers went from high waisted and tapered to a straighter silhouette towards the 30s. Men always wore a hat outdoors, and in the 20s, bowlers, trilbies, and boaters were popular choices. And that's what I got for the 1920s. Again, we can definitely go more in depth than what I've gone over here. And I definitely encourage you to click on my description box, check out my list of books that I've used for research, and just start digging on your own. Please give this video a thumbs up if you learned something new today. Remember, I'm doing a new video every first Tuesday of the month and a live stream every third Tuesday of the month until I finish my book. Subscribe, hit that notification bell so you can keep track of my video schedule. Let me know in the comments if you want more in this fashion history series, and I'll see you in the next video.